On a bright spring afternoon, when the cherry blossoms were in full bloom and children's laughter filled the air, a heartwarming yet eye-opening story unfolded at Pine Grove Park. Mrs. Chen, a kind-hearted black woman in her mid-30s, watched her 6-year-old son playing on the swings, her eyes twinkling with joy as he soared higher and higher. "Higher, Mom. Look how high I can go," little Alex called out, his blonde hair catching the sunlight as he pumped his legs enthusiastically. Mrs. Chen sat on a wooden bench nearby, occasionally waving and giving him a thumbs up, just like any other mother would do. The park was bustling with its usual afternoon crowd. Young parents chatted while pushing strollers, elderly couples walked their dogs, and children chased each other around the playground equipment. It was the kind of perfect day that made everyone want to be outside. Mrs. Chen had specifically chosen this time for their park visit because Alex had done exceptionally well in his spelling test that morning. His teacher had sent her a message praising his improvement, and she wanted to celebrate. She even packed his favorite apple slices and peanut butter sandwich as a special treat. As Alex continued playing, making friends with other kids as he always did, Mrs. Chen pulled out her phone to take a few pictures. She loved capturing these precious moments, her son's uninhibited joy, his bright smile, the way he easily made friends with everyone he met. These were the moments that made her heart overflow with gratitude for the blessing of motherhood. What Mrs. Chen didn't notice was Mrs. Howard, an elderly woman who had been watching them intently from her usual spot near the rose garden. Mrs. Howard had lived in the neighborhood for over 4 decades and prided herself on keeping an eye on things. Today, her attention was firmly fixed on Mrs. Chen and Alex, her forehead creased with growing concern. The more Mrs. Howard watched, the more convinced she became that something wasn't right. In her mind, it just didn't add up. A black woman with a white child. She had never seen them in the neighborhood before, though, in reality, Mrs. Chen and her family had moved to the area almost 3 years ago. Mrs. Howard's fingers nervously twisted the strap of her floral handbag as she continued to observe them. Meanwhile, Alex had made a new friend at the monkey bars. The two boys were challenging each other to see who could cross them faster, their excited shouts mixing with the general playground noise. Mrs. Chen smiled, remembering her own childhood days of playground competitions and instant friendships. "Be careful, sweetie," she called out when Alex attempted a particularly tricky move. Her son responded with the confident grin that always reminded her of his father. "I got this, Mom," he shouted back, successfully completing his challenge. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the playground, Mrs. Chen checked her watch. They would need to head home soon to start dinner preparations. Her husband would be returning from his dentistry practice, and they had planned to have a family meal together. Just as she was about to call Alex over for his snack, she noticed Mrs. Howard approaching with determined steps, her face set in a stern expression. The peace of their perfect afternoon was about to be disrupted, though Mrs. Chen didn't know it yet. She simply smiled politely at the approaching elderly woman, the way she always did when meeting someone new in their community. Little did she know that this encounter would turn into a story that would challenge prejudices and touch hearts across their entire neighborhood. Alex's laughter continued to ring through the air, a sweet soundtrack to what was about to become a much more complicated afternoon than anyone had expected. The gentle spring breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers, creating a stark contrast to the tension that was about to unfold in this peaceful park setting. Mrs. Howard stopped directly in front of Mrs. Chen's bench, casting a shadow over the mother who was still sorting through Alex's snacks. The elderly woman clutched her purse tightly, her knuckles turning white with tension. A group of nearby parents glanced over, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Excuse me," Mrs. Howard's voice quivered slightly, though her tone was sharp. "I need to know what you're doing with that child." She spoke loudly enough that several heads turned in their direction. Mrs. Chen felt her heart sink. She experienced moments like this before, but it never got easier. Taking a deep breath, Mrs. Chen maintained her calm demeanor. "I'm watching my son play," she replied gently, gesturing toward Alex, who was still having the time of his life on the monkey bars. "Would you like to sit down?" she offered, moving over slightly on the bench. But Mrs. Howard wasn't interested in sitting. "Your son?" she questioned, her voice rising with disbelief. "I find that very hard to believe. I've been watching you take pictures of him. It seems very suspicious to me." Her words carried across the playground, causing more parents to turn their attention to the unfolding scene. A young mother with twins, who often saw Mrs. Chen at the local grocery store, started walking over, concerned about what she was witnessing. Meanwhile, Alex noticed the growing tension and began making his way toward his mother, his previous playfulness replaced with uncertainty. "Mom," Alex called out, his small sneakers kicking up wood chips as he approached. "Is everything okay?" The concern in his young voice made Mrs. Chen's heart ache. She had always tried to protect him from moments like these. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," Mrs. Chen assured him, holding out the apple slices she'd packed. "Why don't you show your new friend how to do that cool monkey bar trick you learned?" But Mrs. Howard stepped between them, her face flushed with what she believed was righteous concern. "Young man," Mrs. Howard addressed Alex directly, her voice suddenly honey-sweet. "Do you know this woman? Are you really supposed to be with her?" The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Other children had stopped playing, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Before Alex could answer, Mrs. Chen stood up, her full height matching Mrs. Howard's. Her voice remained steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "I understand you're concerned," she said, "but you're frightening my son. I'm his mother, his adoptive mother, and we're here celebrating his spelling test success." The mother with twins had reached them by now. "Mrs. Chen, I didn't know Alex had aced his spelling test. That's wonderful news," she exclaimed, deliberately loud enough for everyone to hear. Her friendly greeting carried the weight of verification, but Mrs. Howard remained unconvinced. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, Mrs. Howard declared, pulling out her phone. "And I've never seen anything like this. I'm sorry, but I have to make a call. It's better to be safe than sorry." Her fingers began dialing, each button pressed deliberate and dramatic. Mrs. Chen felt her chest tighten, but years of dealing with similar situations had taught her how to handle these moments. She reached for her own phone, pulling up her family photo album. "Before you make that call," she said calmly, "would you like to see pictures from Alex's adoption day? Or maybe the video from his kindergarten graduation last month?" More parents had gathered now, forming a protective circle around Mrs. Chen and Alex. The young boy had returned to his mother's side, confused by all the attention but feeling safe in her presence. He grabbed another apple slice, munching away while looking between the adults with curious eyes. Mrs. Howard's finger hovered over the last number, her certainty beginning to waver as she noticed the growing crowd of supporters around Mrs. Chen. The afternoon sun continued to shine cheerfully, seemingly unaware of the tension it illuminated in this corner of the playground. The next few moments would determine whether this would become a story of understanding or escalation. Despite the growing crowd of supportive neighbors, Mrs. Howard took 3 steps back and pressed the final number on her phone. The playground fell eerily quiet, with only the creaking of empty swings in the breeze and distant traffic sounds filling the air. Mrs. Chen closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her strength, while keeping one hand reassuringly on Alex's shoulder. "Yes, police." Mrs. Howard spoke into her phone, her voice shaking but determined. "I'm at Pine Grove Park, and there's a situation here that needs immediate attention." She turned her back to the group, but her words carried clearly across the now silent playground. "I believe I'm witnessing a possible, well, a suspicious situation with a child." The mother with twins stepped closer to Mrs. Chen, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulders. "This is ridiculous," she whispered. "We see you and Alex at the grocery store every week. Everyone knows you're his mother." Other parents nodded in agreement, their faces showing a mix of embarrassment and anger at Mrs. Howard's actions. Alex tugged at his mother's sleeve, his blue eyes wide with confusion. "Mom, why is that lady on the phone? Did I do something wrong?" The innocence in his question made several nearby parents tear up. Mrs. Chen knelt down to his level, something she always did when explaining important things to him. "No, sweetheart," she said softly, straightening his slightly crooked shirt collar. "You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes grown-ups get confused, and they need help understanding that families can look different from each other. Remember how we talked about that?" Alex nodded, though his forehead remained wrinkled with concern. Meanwhile, Mrs. Howard was getting more animated on the phone. "Yes, there's a woman here with a child who, well, they don't match, if you understand what I mean." She glanced back at the group, seemingly startled to see how many people had gathered in support of Mrs. Chen. "The child appears to be in good spirits, but I just want to make sure everything is proper." Mrs. Chen pulled out her phone again, this time dialing her husband's number. The dental clinic where he worked was only 10 minutes away. "Hi, honey," she said when he answered, her voice steady despite everything. "Could you come to the park? We have a situation here that needs your attention." She could hear him immediately moving, the concern evident in his voice as he promised to be there in 5 minutes. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the playground as everyone waited. Parents who needed to leave gave Mrs. Chen quick hugs or supportive pats on the shoulder before going, while others stayed, forming a protective circle around the family. Alex had returned to snacking on his apple slices, now sharing them with another child whose mother was among those who stayed. Mrs. Howard paced back and forth near the rose garden, still on the phone with the police dispatcher. Her certainty seemed to waver as she watched Alex naturally interact with his mother, the way he leaned against her leg, how he looked up at her for permission before sharing his snack, the gentle way she wiped apple juice from his chin with a tissue from her purse. These were the small, intimate gestures that couldn't be faked. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension. Mrs. Chen took another deep breath, pulling out the adoption papers she'd learned to always carry in her purse. Alex's baby photos, his adoption certificate, his most recent school pictures, she had them all ready. Years of similar experiences, though thankfully rare, had taught her to be prepared. "The police are coming," she explained to Alex, who had perked up at the sound of sirens. "Remember how Mommy sometimes has to show people our special papers? This is one of those times." Alex nodded seriously, familiar with this routine despite his young age. He grabbed his mother's hand, squeezing it tight, a gesture that brought tears to the eyes of several watching parents. As the police car pulled into the park's parking lot, Mrs. Chen stood tall, surrounded by neighbors who knew the truth. The afternoon was about to take another turn, but she was ready to face whatever came next, with her son's small hand firmly in hers and a community standing behind them. 2 police officers stepped out of their patrol car, their movements calm and measured as they surveyed the scene before them. Officer Lee, a young Asian American woman, and Officer Thompson, an older African American man with gentle eyes, approached the group with professional composure. The setting sun painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks, creating a peaceful backdrop to the tense situation. Mrs. Howard rushed forward to meet them, her floral handbag swinging wildly. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. I called about." Her words trailed off as she noticed a familiar silver car pulling into the parking lot, Mr. Chen's dental practice logo visible on the door. Officer Thompson held up his hand politely, interrupting Mrs. Howard's rushed explanation. "Ma'am, let's all take a moment to stay calm. We'll speak with everyone involved." His deep voice carried a natural authority that seemed to settle the nervous energy in the air. Mr. Chen joined the group, still wearing his white dental coat in his hurry to arrive. He immediately went to his wife and son, placing a protective hand on Alex's shoulder. The boy's face lit up at his father's arrival. "Dad," the The police car has really cool lights," Alex exclaimed, somehow still finding excitement in the situation. Officer Lee approached the family first, her friendly smile helping to ease some of the tension. "Hello, everyone. I understand there's been some concern here today. Would you mind if we talked for a few minutes?" She knelt down to Alex's level, something that made Mrs. Chen appreciate her approach immediately. "Hi there," Officer Lee said to Alex. "Is it okay if I ask you a few questions?" Alex looked up at his parents, who both nodded encouragingly. "Sure," he replied, holding up his half-eaten apple slice. "Want some? Mom always packs extra." The simple innocence of his offer brought smiles to several faces, even causing Officer Thompson to chuckle as he joined them. Mrs. Howard watched from a few feet away, her earlier certainty beginning to crack as she observed the family's natural interactions. "Can you tell me about your day?" Officer Lee asked Alex, who launched into an excited description of his spelling test success, the monkey bars, and his new playground friend, all while casually holding both his parents' hands, swinging them back and forth. Mr. Chen quietly handed Officer Thompson their family documents: adoption papers, Alex's birth certificate, and recent family photos. "We keep these with us," he explained softly. "Unfortunately, this isn't the first time we faced questions about our family." The mother with twins stepped forward, along with several other parents. "Officers, we all know the Chen family," she explained. "They're active members of our community. Alex and my boys are in the same class at Oak Elementary." Officer Thompson reviewed the documents while Officer Lee continued chatting with Alex, who was now proudly showing her his spelling test that his mom had carefully tucked away in her purse. The officer's expression softened as he looked through years of family photos, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, first day of school pictures, all telling the story of a loving family. Mrs. Howard had grown quieter, her earlier righteous concern fading as she watched the scene unfold. The setting sun cast long shadows across her face, highlighting the moment when realization began to dawn in her eyes. "Officers," Mrs. Chen spoke up, her voice clear and dignified. "I understand why Mrs. Howard was concerned. She saw something that seemed unusual to her and wanted to protect a child. While her approach was hurtful, I appreciate that she cares about children's safety." Her words carried no bitterness, only understanding, though the pain of the experience was visible in her eyes. Alex, still holding the apple slice, walked over to Mrs. Howard. "Would you like some?" He offered again, his simple gesture of kindness bringing tears to the elderly woman's eyes. The playground had grown quiet, everyone watching this small moment of connection that seemed to represent something much bigger. Officer Lee stood up, brushing wood chips from her uniform. The investigation was clearly reaching its conclusion, but the story unfolding in this park was far from over. As the sun continued its descent, casting golden light across the playground, it became clear to everyone present that this evening would leave a lasting impact on their community. While Officer Thompson continued reviewing the family's documents, Mrs. Chen gently pulled out her phone and opened her photo gallery. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the emotion of sharing these precious memories. "I'd like to show you something," she said softly, gesturing for Mrs. Howard to come closer. The elderly woman hesitated, her earlier confidence now replaced with visible discomfort. But something in Mrs. Chen's gentle demeanor drew her forward, like a warm light on a cold evening. Other parents gathered around too, curious to see the family's story unfold. "This was the day we first met Alex," Mrs. Chen began, showing a photo of a tiny 3-year-old Alex sitting in a room filled with toys. "He was so interested in my stethoscope. I used to work as a nurse before opening my daycare center." The picture showed little Alex holding a toy stethoscope, grinning widely at the camera. Mr. Chen pulled up another photo on his phone. "And this was the day the adoption became final," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The image showed the three of them outside a courthouse. Alex perched on his father's shoulders, all of them beaming with joy. He insisted on wearing his superhero cape to court. Officer Lee smiled warmly at the photos, while Alex bounced excitedly, pointing at each one. "Oh, that's my birthday party. And that's when we got Pepper," he exclaimed, referring to a photo of him hugging a small golden retriever puppy. Each image showed moments of pure, unfiltered family love. Mrs. Howard's face softened as she watched more photos scroll by. Alex helping his mom in their vegetable garden, father and son building a birdhouse together, family trips to the zoo, ordinary moments of extraordinary love. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice catching. "I just thought." "You thought you were protecting a child." Mrs. Chen completed her sentence gently. "I understand that. But look at these." She pulled up a series of photos from their daily life. Alex fast asleep on his father's chest, his mom checking his temperature when he had a cold, family movie nights with all three squished onto their couch. The mother with twins stepped forward, pulling out her own phone. "I have some photos too," she offered, showing pictures from the school's recent field day. There was Alex and her boys running a three-legged race together, Mrs. Chen cheering from the sidelines. They've been inseparable since kindergarten started. Officer Thompson handed the documents back to Mr. Chen with a warm smile. "Everything is clearly in order here," he stated officially, though his eyes showed he'd known this for a while. "Your family's documentation is impeccable." Alex, who had been surprisingly patient throughout all this, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, can I show everyone my special book?" Mrs. Chen nodded, and Alex ran to her bag, pulling out a well-loved photo album. "This is my storybook," he announced proudly to the gathered crowd. The album was clearly made with love, each page decorated with stickers and careful handwriting. "See, this is when I was little," Alex explained to Mrs. Howard, who had knelt down to look. "And this is when I met Mom and Dad. And this is when the judge said we were forever family." Tears began rolling down Mrs. Howard's cheeks as she looked at the album pages. Each photo, each memory, each moment captured told the story of a family bound not by blood, but by something equally powerful: love, choice, and commitment. The setting sun cast a warm glow over the group as they gathered around Alex and his special book. Even the officers stayed, touched by this unexpected moment of community and understanding. The playground equipment stood silent in the background, witness to this transformation of hearts and minds. Mrs. Chen wrapped an arm around her son as he continued showing his photos to everyone. The simple act of sharing their family's story had turned a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for education and growth. As the evening light softened, it became clear that sometimes the most powerful way to change minds is simply to open hearts. As the group continued looking through Alex's special book, Officer Lee's face suddenly lit up with recognition. "Wait a minute," she said, snapping her fingers. "Dr. Chen, you're the dentist who helped my daughter last month. She was so scared about her first cavity, but you made her feel brave." Mr. Chen smiled warmly, remembering the young patient. Yes, the little girl with the unicorn backpack. How is she doing with her new brushing routine?" This simple exchange caused Mrs. Howard to look up sharply, her perception shifting yet again as she realized just how connected the Chen family was to their community. "And Mrs. Chen," Officer Thompson added, his deep voice carrying across the playground, "my wife can't stop talking about the music program you started at your daycare center. She says it's amazing how you teach the little ones to play piano." His words drew nods of agreement from several parents whose children attended the center. Alex beamed with pride at hearing people praise his parents. "Mom teaches me piano too," he announced, pretending to play keys in the air. "I'm learning Twinkle, Twinkle Little Star, but sometimes I still mess up the middle part." His innocent admission made everyone laugh, further melting the remaining tension. The mother with twins stepped forward again. Mrs. Howard, you know the holiday food drive at the community center. The Chens organize that every year. Last December, they helped over 50 families have a proper Christmas dinner. She gestured toward Mrs. Chen, who blushed at the recognition. We believe in giving back, Mrs. Chen said softly, squeezing Alex's shoulder. We've been blessed with so much love in our lives, it only feels right to share it with others. Her words carried no hint of anger or resentment about the earlier confrontation, only genuine warmth and understanding. A teenage boy who had been watching from the basketball court walked over, dribbling his ball. Dr. Chen helped me get my braces last year when my family couldn't afford them, he shared, displaying a confident smile. He set up a payment plan that my mom could manage, and now I'm not embarrassed to smile anymore. Mrs. Howard sat heavily on a nearby bench, overwhelmed by these revelations. The family she had suspected of wrongdoing was, in fact, a cornerstone of the community she claimed to protect. Each new story added another crack to her previously rigid worldview. Would anyone like some cookies? Asked Alex hopefully, pulling a slightly squished package from his backpack. Mom always packs extra in case I make new friends. The simple, generous gesture, so clearly learned from his parents, touched everyone present. Officer Lee accepted a cookie with a smile, then turned to address the group. You know, in our line of work, we do need people to stay alert and report genuine concerns. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But what we're seeing here is something beautiful. A family that not only loves each other, but makes their whole community better. Mr. Chen, still in his dental coat, wrapped an arm around his wife's shoulders. When we adopted Alex, he shared, we didn't just become parents. We made a promise to raise him with love, to teach him kindness, and to show him that family is about what's in your heart, not what you look like. A cool evening breeze rustled through the trees as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in deep purples and blues. The playground equipment cast long shadows across the ground, but the warmth of the gathering kept everyone in place, drawn into this unexpected moment of community connection. Alex, having distributed his cookies, returned to his mom's side and yawned sleepily. Can we come back to the park tomorrow? He asked, seemingly unfazed by the day's events. I want to show my new friends my monkey bar trick again. His innocent request reminded everyone that, through a child's eyes, love and friendship know no boundaries. The truth had emerged not just through documents and photos, but through the web of lives the Chen family had touched. Their story was written not only in official papers, but in cavity-free smiles, piano lessons, holiday meals, and countless small kindnesses that had rippled through their community, creating waves of positive change. The weight of her mistake crashed over Mrs. Howard like a wave as she sat on the park bench, watching Alex share the last of his cookies. Her hands trembled as she clutched her floral handbag, her earlier certainty crumbling with each passing moment. The playground lights had flickered on, casting a gentle glow over the gathered community. I don't know what to say, she finally whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting. She trailed off, unable to finish her sentence as tears welled up in her eyes. The same hands that had so confidently dialed the police now shook as she wiped her tears away. Mrs. Chen, in an act of extraordinary kindness, sat down beside her. You know, she said gently, when we first started the adoption process, we had to take classes about handling situations like this. They told us people might question our family, might not understand. But they also taught us something important, that these moments can be opportunities for change. The mother with twins nodded, joining them with her boys and Tao. I remember when the Chens first moved to our neighborhood, she shared. My boys were so excited because Alex knew all about dinosaurs, their favorite topic. They didn't see different skin colors or question why his parents looked different from him. They just saw a friend who could tell them which dinosaur was the fastest. Officer Lee, who had stayed to ensure everything remained peaceful, smiled at this. Children often have the wisdom we adults sometimes forget, she observed, watching Alex demonstrate his dinosaur knowledge to a growing group of fascinated kids. Mr. Chen, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. "Mrs. Howard," he said kindly, "would you like to see something?" He pulled out his phone again, but this time he showed a different kind of photo. A much younger version of himself as a child, standing next to an elderly white woman. "This was my third-grade teacher, Mrs. Baldwin. When my family first immigrated here, I barely spoke English. She stayed after school every day to help me learn. She showed me that kindness crosses all boundaries." Mrs. Howard looked at the photo, then at the Chen family, and finally at her own reflection in her phone screen. "I've lived here for 40 years, she said softly, watching this neighborhood change. Sometimes change scared me. I thought I was protecting what I knew, but instead," she glanced at Alex, who was now teaching other children his special monkey bar technique, his laughter floating across the playground. A teenage girl who had been watching from nearby approached, holding her phone. "Look at this," she said, showing everyone a social media post from last Christmas. It was a photo of the Chen family's food drive, with Alex wearing a tiny Santa hat while helping to hand out meals. "My mom got help from their food drive last year when she lost her job. They didn't just give us food, they gave us hope." The evening air had grown cooler, but nobody seemed eager to leave. Parents who had arrived to pick up their children stayed, drawn into this moment of community transformation. Alex had started a game of tag with his friends, their shadows dancing under the playground lights, their giggles a soundtrack to this unexpected evening. Mrs. Howard watched the children play, her perspective visibly shifting. "I've spent so many years watching this park," she mused, her voice steadier now. "I thought I was keeping it safe. But maybe—" she looked at Mrs. Chen. "Maybe I was just keeping myself from seeing the beautiful changes happening right in front of me." The kids continued their game, weaving between the adults, their energy undiminished by the late hour. In their play, there were no barriers, no prejudices, no preconceptions, just the pure joy of friendship and fun. Their innocent laughter seemed to wash away the tension of the earlier confrontation, replacing it with something more powerful: understanding. As the evening stars began to twinkle above the park, it became clear that this wasn't just about one family's story anymore. It was about a community learning to see with new eyes, to open their hearts to different kinds of love, and to recognize that family, like love itself, knows no boundaries. Instead of responding with anger or resentment, Mrs. Chen saw an opportunity to turn this difficult moment into something meaningful. As the playground lights cast a warm glow over the gathered families, she gently touched Mrs. Howard's arm. "Would you like to hear how Alex became part of our family?" she asked softly. Mrs. Howard, her eyes still damp with tears, nodded slowly. Other parents drew closer, their children playing nearby but still within earshot, creating an impromptu community circle under the evening sky. 3 years ago, Mrs. Chen began, her voice warm with memory, we were visiting the children's home where I volunteered as a nurse. Alex was there, sitting alone, reading a dinosaur book upside down. She smiled at the memory. He looked up at us and asked if we knew why T-Rex had such small arms. Mr. Chen chuckled, picking up the story. I told him it was so they couldn't brush their teeth, which is why they were always angry. He laughed so hard he got hiccups. The gathered crowd smiled, watching Alex now showing his friends a new game he'd invented. We didn't go there looking to adopt, Mrs. Chen continued. But sometimes the heart finds what it needs before the mind knows what it's looking for. Over the next few months, we kept visiting. Alex would save interesting rocks to show me and would tell my husband all about the birds he saw in the yard. The mother with twins wiped away a tear as Mrs. Chen went on. The day we told Alex we wanted to be his parents, he asked us if that meant he could help plant a garden. Not if he could have toys or his own room. He wanted to grow things with us. Her voice caught slightly at the memory. Officer Lee, who had stayed far longer than required, smiled warmly. "That explains the amazing vegetable garden I see when driving past your house," she said. "Those sunflowers are taller than my patrol car." Mrs. Howard looked down at her hands, no longer clutching her handbag so tightly. "I watched you in the garden sometimes from my morning walks," she admitted quietly. "I never realized, I just didn't understand." "Understanding takes time," Mr. Chen said kindly. "And sometimes it takes courage to admit when we've misunderstood something. You know, when we first moved here, some neighbors didn't quite know what to make of us either." A dad who had been quietly listening spoke up. "I remember that first neighborhood barbecue when you moved in. Alex taught all our kids that dinosaur game, and now it's like a neighborhood tradition. Every summer barbecue, there they go, stomping around like little T-Rexes." As if on cue, Alex led a group of children in a dinosaur parade around the playground, all of them making their best roaring sounds. The sight brought laughter from all the adults, breaking down any remaining tension. Mrs. Chen reached into her bag and pulled out a community newsletter. "We're actually organizing a Family Diversity Day at the community center next month," she explained. "There will be all kinds of families sharing their stories. Adoptive families, mixed-race families, single-parent families. Would you like to help us plan it, Mrs. Howard?" The elderly woman looked startled at the invitation, but then a small smile crossed her face. I make good lemonade," she offered hesitantly. "And I could bring those cookies my grandmother taught me to bake." "Perfect," Mr. Chen exclaimed. "Every good community event needs refreshments. And maybe you could share stories about how our neighborhood has grown and changed over the years. History is important too." The playground had grown quieter as some families began heading home for dinner, but the warmth of connection lingered in the cooling evening air. Alex ran back to his parents, breathless from play. "Mom, Dad, can we stay just a little longer? We're playing Dinosaur Family, and everyone wants to be in the same family." The innocent wisdom in his words wasn't lost on anyone. As the sky darkened to deep blue and the first stars appeared, this group of neighbors had discovered that family and community could be bigger and more beautiful than any of them had imagined. 1 month later, the community center buzzed with excitement. The Family Diversity Day event had drawn a bigger crowd than anyone expected. Colorful banners hung from the walls, and the aroma of Mrs. Howard's famous lemonade and cookies filled the air. Children darted between display tables, each showcasing different family stories with photos and personal mementos. Mrs. Chen stood near the entrance, greeting visitors with warm smiles. She could hardly believe how much had changed since that evening at the park. The incident that could have divided their community had instead brought them closer together in unexpected ways. "The lemonade is running low again," Mrs. Howard announced, hurrying over with her floral apron dusted with cookie crumbs. "I'll make another batch. These people are thirstier than Sunday churchgoers." Her eyes twinkled with joy, a far cry from the suspicious woman she'd been just weeks ago. Alex darted past, leading a tour of younger children. "And this is my family's table," he announced proudly, pointing to a display covered with photos, adoption papers, and carefully preserved memories. "See, families can look different but still be full of love." He became quite the little ambassador, repeating the phrase his mother often used. The mother with twins, now the event's official photographer, captured the moment as Mr. Chen joined his son at their table. "Remember to show them your special book," he reminded Alex gently. The well-loved photo album had become something of a celebrity item among the neighborhood children. A young couple lingering near the adoption information booth caught Mrs. Chen's attention. She overheard the woman whisper, "Maybe we could," before her partner squeezed her hand warmly. Mrs. Chen smiled, remembering her own similar conversation years ago. The community center's main hall had been transformed into a vibrant space celebrating all kinds of families. Single parents shared their stories of strength and resilience. Mixed-race couples displayed their wedding photos and cultural celebrations. Grandparents raising grandchildren offered wisdom about unconditional love. Each table told a unique story of family bonds that went beyond traditional expectations. "You know," Mrs. Howard said softly, joining Mrs. Chen by the window, "I used to think I was protecting our neighborhood by watching for anything different or unusual." She paused, watching children of all backgrounds playing together with the toy dinosaurs Alex had insisted on bringing. "Now I realize I was just afraid of change. But change brought us all this beauty." The afternoon light streamed through the windows, catching the silver in Mrs. Howard's hair as she continued, "Last week, my granddaughter asked me why families look different. Instead of feeling uncomfortable, I told her about you and Alex, about how love makes a family, not matching faces." Her voice cracked slightly. She understood immediately, of course. Children always do. Near the refreshment table, Officer Lee chatted with community members, out of uniform, but still radiating warmth and protection. She'd become a regular at neighborhood events, building bridges between law enforcement and families of all backgrounds. Mr. Chen's dental practice had started a new program offering free checkups to adopted children, inspired by the conversations that arose from their family's story. "Small changes can make big differences," he often said, remembering his own childhood experiences with kindness. As the afternoon wore on, Alex gathered everyone for a group photo. Families mixed and mingled, standing together not by appearance, but by the connections they'd formed. Mrs. Howard insisted on being right next to the Chens, her arm linked through Mrs. Chen's as if they'd been friends for years. "Ready?" called the mother with twins, raising her camera. "Say family." The response was thunderous, filled with laughter and joy. In that moment, captured forever in a photograph that would hang in the community center for years to come, the true meaning of community shone through. It wasn't about looking the same or following the same paths. It was about opening hearts to different kinds of love and understanding. As the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows through the windows, Mrs. Chen looked around at the gathered faces, all the people who had been touched by their story and had joined in making their community stronger. Sometimes, she realized, the most beautiful gardens grow from the most unexpected seeds. The event would become an annual tradition, growing larger each year. But more importantly, it marked the beginning of a deeper understanding in their community. That family, in all its beautiful variations, was something to celebrate, not question. And it all started with one afternoon at a park, where love proved stronger than prejudice.